All right, welcome to the Civility session with Delta Dental today. I'm going to hand this over to Nolan Finley and Stephen Henderson, and I'd like you guys to introduce yourselves and the Civility Project, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Lynn. Steve, is that your dog?
It's not my dog. I don't know whose dog that is. My dogs don't really bark like that.
Well, thank you all for joining us. We want to thank Lynn for facilitating this. Also thank Delta Dental, who has been our sponsor of the Civility Project, which has been forced by the virus to change its nature. We're now doing these sessions by Zoom. We used to do them in person, and we kind of like this. Steve, this is we get to see everybody up close.
And don't have to leave the house.
We don't have to leave the house, but it's good. We've been doing this now for a couple of years a few years in various formats, and then about a year or so ago, the Detroit Chamber came to us and asked us to sort of talk about how we manage to maintain our relationship despite having starkly different views. And I'm laughing a little bit because we just come off a TV show where we had a big racket, and nobody who listened to that would ever use us as examples of civility. But I want you to know, Steve, I felt bad, and I'm sorry if I said anything to hurt your feelings.
I don't get my feelings hurt.
So anyway, what we wanted, our intention in all of this is to sort of help people understand that you can have the most severe political disagreements and the biggest rackets in the world over politics and still maintain healthy friendships and civil conversations that lead to a greater understanding. And if anything, I think as divisive the issues we face today and as polarizing the issues and as passionate as people are about their positions, having the ability to discuss our differences in a productive manner, very important.
Yeah, it is. And I think when we think about both what we're confronting right now with this pandemic and the disruption both to our lives and to the economy, but if we also think before this, like think about what we were talking about right before this happened and what was going on in this country right before this happened. I mean, the idea of being able to sit down and actually discuss things with people that you don't agree with is at a real premium. There aren't a lot of opportunities to do it, and most of us don't do it very well. Most of us find ourselves, I think, fighting a lot, arguing and insulting a lot about the things that divide us. And so one of the things that I think helped give birth to this project was both Nolan and I noticing the way dialogue is changing and has changed. Nolan and I have known each other for about 12 or 13 years now, and have always sat on opposite sides of political issues, and have been able, despite those differences, to be able to forge a relationship that is about more than those disagreements. But I think in the last 4 to 5, maybe 6 years, I think we both noticed that the world around us has become more intolerant of that kind of exchange, and has almost switched to the position of lifting up the idea of bitter and awful conflict of sort of scorekeeping kind of arguments. And so we really wanted to get at this idea of how to do it differently. And what we've been able to come up with over that period of time that allows us to do it, differently. And so the Civility Project grows out of that, out of our effort to examine our own interactions and relationship, and then try to help other people see that it's possible. One of the sort of pivotal exercises that we did as part of this was a couple of years ago when NPR's StoryCorps was in Detroit, and they came and set up a little Winnebago kind of camper thing on the grounds of the DIA downtown in Detroit, and invited people to come in. You could schedule an hour of time to come in and talk and record yourself talking with anybody you wanted. And most people were picking their spouses or other family members to go do that with, to tell stories about their lives. I picked Nolan and said he and I ought to go down there and sit for an hour and talk. And what I wanted us to talk about was where we get the things that we believe. I think it's really easy to have conversations about what you believe and to stand up for the things you think are right. I think it's a lot harder to actually examine where that comes from and explore where it comes from with somebody who you have a substantial amount of disagreement with. And what I wanted us to be able to do was to not argue about the things that divide us, or the things even that we might agree on. What I wanted us to do was talk and to tell each other what our stories were, as a way of expanding that understanding on the other side. And I think it's really hard, or I should say a lot harder, for people to be uncivil with each other, to be unable to have civil disagreement when you don't know those things. If you are making assumptions about why the other person believes what they believe, or you're basing it on some scrap of information you've gotten about why they believe what they believe. I wanted us to be able to have that conversation in long form, with lots of time for each of us to talk about where we got the things that we believe. And out of that, I think both of us had a different understanding of each other, but I also think it makes it easier to be able to have discussions about things we disagree about, to have arguments, and to, again, not let it rise to the level of personal animus, of dismissal of the other person, of bitter disagreement. And so that kind of was the model, right? That was kind of the model that we developed.
Yeah.
And we've been trying to share that model with people, asking them to find somebody that you disagree with, find somebody who comes from a different perspective, and have a conversation about why that's true, about where those beliefs come from, as a way of trying to understand each other, and then to be able to facilitate the ability to actually talk about the things that divide you.
And during that StoryCorps session, we didn't talk about a single political issue. We didn't talk about a single thing we disagreed on specifically. What we talked about, as Steve mentioned, was we asked each other questions and we listened to each other's answers about how we come to think the way we think. And that's the starting point, I think, if you want to try to engage in civil conversations with people on the other side, if you will, the people who think differently than you, but you truly want to engage. It's starting with that conversation about how do you form your opinions? What informs your decision-making process? What about your background? What about your belief system brings you to come down either here or there on an issue or in the middle? And what we have found in talking to a lot of people about this is most people, and certainly he and I, come to our decisions the same way. I mean, we take the facts, look at the information, and apply our own values and experiences to them. And that's how we come to frame, to frame our opinions. And it's useful. It was useful for me knowing where Steve came from and what his belief and value system was. And I'm sure it was for him knowing mine. And the idea is that just because someone disagrees with you doesn't make them stupid or evil. They simply have applied their own values and experiences to a situation and come up with a different viewpoint. And that's a useful thing to understand, because once you understand why someone holds the worldview they have, you can talk to them more as a person rather than as as a politics, if you will. People are individuals; they're not their politics. And if you get to who that individual is, I think you have a much better chance of valuing that person's opinion, even if you don't agree with them.
So tell us a little bit about how you define civility, and then maybe some tips for how we achieve it.
But it's an ongoing struggle, isn't it, Steve?
It is all the time.
I mean, here, I guess the basic way we just describe it is this ability to have very passionate discussions and very severe disagreements, and still respect each other as individuals, and still be interested in hearing what the other person has to say. Civility is as much about listening as anything else. And it's about honest listening. It's not about having a conversation in which you wait until that point where you can get back in and say the thing you wanted to say. It's not constantly thinking ahead about what your next response is going to be. It's about truly listening to what the person you're engaged with has to say, and weighing that opinion and using that opinion to challenge your own, rather than just constantly butting heads.
Yeah, and it's also, I think there are some, kind of fundamental values that undergird the idea of civility, and kind of principles. One of them, as Nolan said, is listening.
Mm-hmm.
That art of listening, truly listening, not just not talking. I think in a lot of instances we think of listening as, well, I'm not talking, so I'm listening. It's actually much more difficult than that. It is about really focusing on what the other person is saying and trying to understand what point they're trying to make and where they're coming from. I also think, I say a lot of the time that the idea of not trying to win in a discussion, not trying to score points. If you watch a lot of cable news like I do, you've noticed over the last decade this turn toward almost like cage match debating that goes on, where the the rewards seem to go to somebody for, you know, vanquishing their opponent, or giving that kind of soundbite that gets used over and over to discredit somebody's position. I think you really try to avoid that kind of back and forth. You are trying to educate and understand, not to insult or demean. And that's a really important principle. It's also difficult because, again, I think our culture right now celebrates a lot of that kind of one-upsmanship, or trying to embarrass somebody because they disagree with you. And then the other thing I always say about it is, you know, if it seems like it's easy to be civil, if it seems like it's easy to do this, then you're probably doing it wrong. It is not easy. It is difficult because you're talking about things that are passionate for you and the other person, and where you do have really strong disagreements. I mean, one of the things that Nolan and I don't do is avoid subjects because we think, you know, the other one feels too strongly about it, or we do. The whole idea of this is to get to those places, to have those disagreements, and be able to uphold those other principles at the same time. You know, being able to listen, being able to not try to scorekeep or vanquish somebody. And then the last thing I always say is that you kind of have to approach each conversation with the idea that it's not the last one, that you're going to come back and continue to talk to this person, that you're going to come back and continue to relate to this person and interact, that you actually have a relationship with this person. And so so there's a value beyond the disagreement that you have. You know, there have been lots of times on television or other places that Nolan and I have gotten into it, and you know, your instinct is to say, I don't want to talk to that guy anymore. I'm done with this. It takes, I think, an active choice to say, well, no, I'm not going to do that. I might be mad about something. I might be really, really upset about something, but you have to tell yourself that you will come back. You'll come back to the space that even if you want to take a break from it, because you know you might come to blows if you stay there any longer. The idea is that you come back at some point and continue the conversation and continue to learn more about what the other person believes, as a way of learning more about yourself and your own positions.
So I want to jump in because we have a question already. I'd love to put that before you. So we sort of laid the foundation about civility and the Civility Project. And so this focus is, how do we build civility in a time of crisis, which we've been living now for a couple months, almost a couple months. So the question is, how do we remain civil when core values clash and we are looking at life and or death issues? And what about when your values threaten my well-being? So can you guys speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think that's really what we're living through right now, isn't it? I mean, and part of the conversation Steve had and I had earlier. I mean, yeah, I think you have to go in with that same understanding that, you know, your core values may be sharply different than the other person's core values, but no more valid. You know, stop and listen to the points they're trying to express. Why do they feel, you know, the way they feel? Why is their position so important to them? I think you've got to always constantly want to try to figure out, to gain an understanding of what is motivating the other person, what's frightening them, particularly now. What are they worried about? What's going on in their own families, their own personal situations that are leading them to the positions they're advocating for? What are they worried about? What do they fear? I think those are good questions to ask rather than simply considering only what you fear and what you're worried about. Maybe you find some value in the other person's position. One of the things from the beginning, when Steve first joined the Free Press 15 years ago, I don't know,
13 years, yeah.
15 years ago, you know, I started reading Steve before I ever met Steve. And one of the things that occurred to me when I first started reading him is, wow, I don't agree with his opinions, but I respect the way he posits them. I respect his writing and his arguments and the support he cites for his arguments. And, you know, reading those articles with that in that frame of mind helped me challenge my own arguments. I mean, I never got into this business thinking I was always right. And I always assume I may be wrong. And it's useful to stop and consider the other person's position as a way to challenge your own and make sure there aren't things about your own position that you're turning a blind eye to, that you're ignoring. You know, I think particularly in these times when we're going to have to come to some sort of consensus, it is extremely important that we consider everybody's fears and worries and concerns, and not simply write it off to some evil motives. You know, try to figure out what's going on in their lives and in their own personal situations.
So you brought up something really important, Nolan, that I don't think we've mentioned yet, but I know you guys talk a lot about how the goal is not to convince the other person to believe what you believe, but
No.
it is to understand one another. And you may walk away still disagreeing or not believing the same things. And that often happens. But, you know, what becomes the goal then with civility? Especially, you know, when we're looking at this pandemic, and some people believe we have to open the economy. That's the most important thing. And other people say, oh, no, you're risking lives. And people hold tightly to both sides and they can make arguments for both sides. So where does civility come into that?
Well, I mean, it's a very important piece of that because we need to thoroughly discuss and vet and explore both ideas. We can't lock into one position or the other because there's going to be bad results. We've got to try to find the middle ground. But, you know, you mentioned when you started talking about, you know, we're not trying to convince or convert. I gave up a long time ago trying to convert Steve to my point of view. And I don't quite know what I'd do with him if I did convert him now. I think he would be useless to me and not much fun to be around. So, you know, I'm not looking to constantly be affirmed. I'm looking to be challenged. And if you're someone who is in the opinion business and you're not looking to be challenged, then you're not doing your job right. And there's too many people in the opinion business today who don't want to be challenged. They only want to be affirmed. You watch Steve mentioned cable news earlier. I mean, that's, you know, the breeding ground for this. They don't want their ideas challenged. The folks on whether it's a progressive station or a conservative station, they don't want to be challenged. They want to be affirmed. And too often their audiences want their opinions affirmed rather than to hear anything that challenges them to think beyond where they stand on an issue. And it's very dangerous, I think. We get too comfortable and too smug in our own opinions, and we don't fully weigh all of the alternatives. And, you know, on a macro level, you see what's happening in Washington and even in Lansing, where it almost becomes a sin to consider the other person's position. I'm thinking about the state rep who was just censured by the Democratic Party for, I wrote about her today, Karen Whitsett, for, you know, saying, thank you, Donald Trump, for, telling me about this medicine that she says saved her life. Now, you may think she's completely wrong, but to say she has no right to express her opinion, I think is a very dangerous thing. And if we're not going to talk across party lines, if we're not going to at least try to build a consensus, then we get to a situation where, one party has control and they do everything they want. Then the other party gets control next and they do everything they want. And we have no governing in the middle anymore. There's very little governing in the middle going on in this country.
One of the things about right now that's really difficult is that, and getting back to the question here, is that, people's core values are really on display right now. People are prioritizing what matters the most to them, and they're making decisions based on those priorities. And we don't all have the same priorities. We don't all think of the things that are at stake here in the same ways. And I have to admit that, as somebody who lives in the city of Detroit, where the effects of what's going on are profoundly different than they have been in other places, as somebody who wakes up each morning going through social media, looking at who I know who's sick, who I know who might be dead, who I know who might be dying, my core values kick in instantly. The fear of the loss of life, the fear of loss of community, the fear of what this place will be like when this is all over. Because so many people will just not be here. So many people will just be gone. And really the inability to process that in the way that we normally do, right? When people die, we're accustomed to the idea of some public acknowledgement of it, some communal connection that lets us together move on. The fact that we've been robbed of that by this pandemic is difficult, and so it's really hard, harder than I can remember anything being to acknowledge that the priorities that I have, the things that I think are most important, aren't the same things that other people do. There are a lot of people who feel as though the economic damage that this is doing is equal to, or maybe more important than, the moral side. And that is a clash of values. There's no other way to describe that. And I have to admit that I have not come up with a way to easily have conversations with people who disagree, because it feels so personal, because it's so relentlessly a part of my life right now. I mean, it's much more difficult because there are personal stakes, and I think that is almost always true, right? That when you feel something so deeply, it matters that somebody else doesn't feel that same thing, or doesn't seem to respect that you feel those things. And I think, again, taking time to give yourself a break from the conversation is important. I can't do this 24 hours a day. I can't do this 6 hours a day. I've got to be able to pick my spots, to be able to have that conversation, and then go away from it because it's too raw. I think that's okay. And I think that is actually part of civility, right? Knowing when you can't engage, knowing when it's better not to. I also stay away from some of the things that are the most uncivil that are going on. You think of these demonstrations where people are showing up with machine guns to make their point about the economy, where you have a state legislator show up in the Capitol on the floor with a face mask that's adorning the Confederate flag. I mean, I think civility calls us to call that stuff out and call it out loudly and to say that's not civil. There's nothing civil about showing up at a protest with a machine gun, well, unless it's a gun protest, unless it's about the Second Amendment, it's not appropriate. Wearing a Confederate flag on the floor of the Michigan legislature is not appropriate. I don't care what we're talking about. It's insulting purposely to everybody in the state. I think saying that, but also giving yourself a break from it. Also saying I can't live in that space 24 hours a day is one of the keys to being able to maintain that civil dialogue and be able to talk to people who don't support the Confederate flag or machine guns on the Capitol grounds, but happen to be arguing on the same side. I mean, you got to be able to distinguish among those folks and be able to talk to the people who are making these arguments about what they want to do and why they want to do it differently. Those are all right in our faces right now. All of those kinds of challenges, I think, and choices. And it is not.
I think those are excellent points, Steve. And I would say this, because I think this, goes to the point of what we were scrapping about this morning, and also about, in this time when civility is so hard, that people, it's not necessarily people having different values. It's maybe about people having different worries at the moment and
right.
immediate at the moment. It's not even necessarily priorities. I mean, obviously everybody prioritizes life over everything else, but it's different immediate fears and concerns, and the things that are keeping you up at night, the things that are going on within your own circle of loved ones and family, that have you, that are eating away at your guts. And it's not necessarily different values. At this point, it might be different fears of the moment. And those fears can change anytime. I mean, as well as your priorities can change anytime. But I think the values remain the same. You care about the people who you love who are being impacted by this in very serious ways, whether it's health, whether it's economic. And I think understanding that leads to your ability to ask better questions. What is it that's going on within your family, within your circle of loved ones, that is causing you to have a bigger focus at this point on one piece of this rather than another, or maybe, to weigh them equally. And I think understanding that, particularly during these times, that, it's not, people aren't just being oblivious to danger or whatever. They have real concerns about what's going on in the lives of the people around them. And so it's what you see, most that I think moves you.
So we have a question. What are some exercises you can go through on your own so you are ready to engage in and be a leader of civil conversations?
Well, I mean, the one we put together for this project, and where we ask people to pick out someone you want to know better, but who's someone whom feels differently than you do about the world, and whom you've avoided having conversations with because of that. And sit down and talk about the things that shape you and shape your opinion making. And we always go back to a couple of women who walked together every day for years. They were neighbors, and they went out on their evening walk. And one was, conservative, the other one was liberal, and they never talked about it. They talk about gardening or whatever, their kids, schools, whatever. But they wouldn't talk about why why one felt one way about politics and one felt the other. And they sat out and did this exercise where they, try to get at the roots of each other's belief systems. And, it was they were surprised. A lot of the assumptions they had made about each other turned out to be wrong. And it was very enlightening to, and it deepened their friendship.
Yeah, one of the things I find really useful, and this is literally what you can do alone, is after I have a discussion with somebody or an argument or a debate, I spend a lot of time going back over not just the debate, but what the other person was really trying to say, what the other person's position really was, and why they took that position. And it's a way of challenging yourself, I think, in terms of what your listening skills are like, and how you exist in these kind of spaces. If you can't remember exactly what the other person was saying, you probably weren't doing a good job of listening. If your conclusion is that the other person was completely unreasonable and ignorant and didn't understand anything, I mean, chances are you probably didn't do a great job of really listening. Challenging yourself to be able to almost repeat back in a rational way what somebody else is saying, I think, is a really important part of being able to carry on these kinds of conversations in a way that doesn't degrade into insult and things like that.
So Tanya offered a really interesting comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. She said, this is difficult because individuals can be civil, they can agree not to agree, and yet the end result doesn't change the harmful effects on one or the other. And she said, I think that is what sometimes might cause resistance to civility. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, that gets back to the winning and losing mentality that I think we have a lot. And look, when the stakes are as high as, for instance, they are right now, that becomes even more difficult, right? Because this is literally a life and death kind of equation. And I think people on both sides feel like their lives, either their literal lives or their livelihoods, are at stake. Again, I think it's not about agreeing to disagree so much as it is agreeing to not let the disagreement become so bitter that you can't have a dialogue about it. Because the truth is, if you just agree to disagree, you're right, you don't get things done. The path to solution actually is about finding commonality at some point and agreeing to put aside perhaps some of the things that you might want or feel like you need in order to come up with that solution. Incivility is at least as inefficient or ineffective a way of coming up with a solution as putting aside some of what you might believe or want in favor of actually moving forward. I mean, it's hard to see that sometimes, and it's hard to believe that and to do it. But I think that's generally true. Now, at the same time, I will say there are times when there is a call for incivility. I mean, there are times when you do have to push back, and you have to say, this is a violation of my rights. This is a violation of my space or my dignity, and I don't have to take that. I think those are rare moments, but I don't think civility argues against that. It does argue that in the other spaces, in these one-on-one spaces, especially where you're talking with somebody, that you'd be able to sort of set aside some of what you believe in order to see the other side, in order to understand where somebody else is coming from.
And I think that nails it, Steve, because if you can learn to engage respectfully, then you're much more likely to look at your positions and saying, okay, in the name of reaching a consensus, I can give up these 1, 2, 3 things. They're not as important to me as reaching a consensus. But if you can't engage respectfully, you're much more defensive, unwilling to give up anything in order to come to some sort of collaboration, some sort of agreement. And so I think that civil, respectful conversation is the first step towards consensus building. And sometimes that sort of conversation gets loud and sometimes it gets passionate. But if you understand you're working toward a goal of consensus rather than conversion, I think it's much more productive.
So what about when you actually believe, and I've seen this word come up a few times in questions, but what if you actually believe that another person's opinions create harm to you? And harm, we can actually believe that that is going to physically or emotionally or in some way harm us. It could be subjective, it could be objective. But how do we build understanding or respect in those instances?
Lynn, I think that gets to the basic point here that we've stated, as the premise of this. You've got to move beyond this idea that people who hold different ideas are evil or have ill intent or stupid or ignorant, and figure out why they hold the positions they do and defend the positions they do, and what are their motivations, their history. And I think you can broaden your view a little and see, well, they're not trying to hurt me. They just have a different path toward the solution.
So, I actually think that there are people who hold positions that are harmful to others. I think there are people who, either through misunderstanding or poor intent, hold positions that are really harmful to other people. The history of this country is about that, in fact, that we've had centuries of inequality that crop up from one group of people believing that another doesn't deserve the same full expression of rights under our Constitution or any rights at all. And I think that when you're talking about things like that, it is okay to say, I can't have this argument, or I can't concede that point. I can't let you decide that that my life isn't worth as much as yours, or that my rights aren't. And it's okay to walk away from those situations. I think what civility says, though, is that you give people every opportunity to not be in that box, because most people aren't. I think the assumption that that's everybody who disagrees with you is where the problem comes into play. There are people who are like that, who you cannot have a civil conversation with. But I don't believe that that's anywhere close to the majority. And I don't believe that's even most, a large plurality of the people. I think civility says you make every effort you can to see what somebody is really trying to say, and acknowledge that that where they're coming from is valid, even if you think that the conclusion they're reaching is not valid, as a way of being able to have that debate. And that's a tricky line to walk, right? When is it that your rights are actually on the line? When is it that your life is actually on the line? Right now, there's a bright line, right? We all know that this virus will kill us, and so it's a little simpler, I think, to analyze that situation. But frequently, it requires some more thought and reflection about what someone is saying and why they're saying it, and not being too eager or too quick to just dismiss somebody as evil ignorant or whatever, because most people, I think, are not. And you owe it to yourself to give people the opportunity to show that they're not, to show that that they actually have a legitimate basis for what they're saying, even if what they're saying you don't think is right.
And you're never going to bring about change without engagement. And so you want to choose engagement whenever possible, but you also still want to enter these sort of engagements and these sort of conversation with at least the kernel of a idea that you might have things to learn too. And if you approach a conversation thinking you've got all the answers already and there's nothing you can learn from somebody who is of a different opinion, I think you have to work on yourself first. I think you have to enter every conversation with the idea that you might be the one who needs to change some of your views or could learn something. I think you've got to be open to that idea, to be, a good citizen, if you will. You have to be open to the idea that you can learn something.
Absolutely. So we have a comment, and you guys, we have about 10 minutes. So if there's any last questions or comments, please put them in the chat. So after this comment, if we don't have additional questions, I'll ask you guys to possibly wrap up and maybe give some direction for people on where they can take this information from here. But the comment is, consensus is impossible when starting from the standpoint of ideology versus democracy. We've lost the center ground where compromise was possible. Any thoughts about that?
I think it's impossible. I think it's a lot harder. I think
Nolan, something happened with your microphone.
it was.
There's a lot of feedback. I'm not sure what happened.
Huh. Okay.
Oh, much better. Good. Okay, start again.
All right. Sorry about that. I have no idea what it was. But I don't think anything's impossible, but it is certainly a lot harder when you've got a set of when you've got an ideological sort of list here that you feel you have to adhere to and you can't stray from. I think that's what's got us in trouble in this country, where we say, oh, well, I'm a conservative or I'm a liberal, so I can't endorse this idea or that idea or that idea. You've got to set that aside and work for the common good. I mean, success isn't winning or losing, it's finding common ground. And I would agree that sort of the ideological comfort zones in this country have made it harder to come to the middle, and the middle is a much smaller place than it used to be. But I think it's where most people want to live.
I like that.
Yeah, I think I think that's an interesting juxtaposition: ideology versus democracy. I'm not sure that we always think of them as mutually exclusive, but they certainly they play out that way right now. The inability of people to get past what they believe in order to come together with people who don't believe that to come up with a solution. I mean, whether you're talking about a state legislature or the Congress or any kind of deliberative body, that's what we see, more often than not. I don't necessarily believe that has to be the case. I think that's where we are right now. I don't know that that ideology is anathema to democracy. It's just right now it's foiling democracy in some important ways. But this may sound a little Pollyannish, but we allow that to happen. As citizens in this democracy, we have the power to change that and to say that something else will be the priority. And in fact, right now in the state of Michigan, we're on the very beginning stages of a grand experiment that is exactly is powered by exactly that idea. The redistricting commission that we voted on in 2018 to draw competitive lines for state legislature and Congress is, in its purest expression, an attempt to remove the ideology from that process, to say that we're going to take people from both sides of the aisle, get them together, and let them come up with a way to do that, which is not the way it works now. Right now, it is winner take all. If one party has control of the legislature and the governorship, they can do whatever they want with the legislative maps. And what we've learned from that is that what they'll do is maximize their own advantage. Now we're saying, no, we're going to do it differently. My little public service announcement, you still have the opportunity to sign up to be part of this redistricting commission. And so far, the people who have applied, it's not a terribly representative sample of people here in the state. There are far more men who want to do it than women. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but I think the best outcome here would be that it would be a pretty representative body. So if you're a woman who's interested in making things look a little fairer, maybe send in your application and volunteer to do that. But
even tell us where people can find information about that, or maybe
I think you go to I'm pretty sure you go to the Secretary of State's website to find that, or if you type in Michigan Redistricting Commission in Google, I'm pretty sure you would come across that as well.
Well, back to this question, of ideology versus democracy. I would frame it as ideology versus pragmatism, and I catch heat all the time from people who say, well, how could you have taken that position? You're a conservative. How can you? And I'm like, okay, who gets to define what conservative or progressive means? I am informed by conservative values, but I'm also a pragmatist who understands we have to have solutions. We can't, our ideological beliefs do us no good if they don't serve a solution. And I think we all should be pragmatists first. How are we going to get to a practical solution that incorporates the values of both sides in whatever formula it takes to put a solution in place?
So we have a final comment that I'll offer you guys. And then also thank you to everybody who participated. I know several people had 1 o'clock meetings, so they had to duck out, but they've asked for the video, which we will post on the Civility Project website, and we'll send to Delta Dental as well. And if you have other groups that you think would benefit from a session like this, we are booking them, so you can let me know. But Tanya said, thank you. These are the conversations we don't have enough. They require patience, empathy, respect, and willingness to change. Many have given up because the conversations feel fruitless. But when we look at history, it has been patient persistence that has moved us even as far forward as we have come. So do you have any last words that you'd like to offer in our final moments together?
Well, yeah, I think in this period of isolation, if you will, it's more important than ever. You got to work harder than ever to engage a broader group of people. I think we get in trouble when we bunker down with the people who affirm our opinions, who agree with us, who tell us how brilliant we are, and never engage with people who hold differing opinions and want to challenge us and want to force us to think a little deeper. I think it's important in these times to do whatever you can to broaden your network.
Yeah, I think, and once we get back to the world in some way and, interacting with each other, taking that opportunity to find those people who you think, maybe I disagree with this person, or maybe this person comes from a point of view that I don't like or don't understand, and reaching out to them to say, hey, let's go have lunch. Let's go have a drink. Let's go have a cup of coffee and begin that dialogue about, again, not the things that necessarily divide you, but but who you are and why you believe the things that you believe, as a way of trying to build a relationship that makes it easier to talk about those things that you don't agree with. I think that is, that's one of those first step things in this whole civility exercise that I think is important. And it can be someone from work, it could be someone in your neighborhood, it could be someone from church or school or wherever. There are lots of opportunities in most of our lives, I think, to try to take that first step and begin to come at this whole thing a little differently.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank everybody who gave us their time today and attention, and really appreciate you being here. This recording, again, will be available probably by tomorrow, and we can send links to everybody. In the chat, there's a link to the Michigan redistricting information if you'd like to find out more, and if you'd like to book another civility session, just let me know. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Thanks, Stephen and Nolan. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dental, for sponsoring us. We appreciate you.
Very, very much.